Great. Well, thanks a lot, Catherine, for that introduction, for the great moderating that you've been doing so far today. And I'm glad to have a really solid lineup of panelists here to talk about some of the infrastructure challenges and opportunities that our country faces. Certainly, a country the size of Canada, the movement of goods, the movement of people, and also the movement of data and the digital economy is absolutely critical for the success and our future long-term growth. I think it goes without saying that a lot of this, of course, is linked to supply chains, and that's a word that we've all just been rolling off the tongue the last 2 years. Whether it was pallets of toilet paper at Costco getting snapped up in seconds, or now difficulties as I found the other day getting a TV stand at IKEA. Everything seems to be on back order. So really, infrastructure is the lifeblood that enables the goods and the people and the data to all move across the country. We're going to have a chance to talk about that over the next hour or so. And as with all of our other panels, I would really encourage people to keep submitting questions through Slido at hashtag CAN360, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can throughout the conversation. So with us today, we have Deborah Flint from the Greater Toronto Airports Authority, Robin Sylvester from the Port of Vancouver, Aaron Corey from the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and Gord McKenzie from Canada Potex. So thank you everyone for making the time to join us today. So maybe just to start off the conversation, Gord, I'll turn to you first. We've been hearing again a lot about supply chains, product shortages, and infrastructure being such a big part of the conversation. Extreme weather events in British Columbia, whether it's the floods or the fires. And so looking back maybe first at 2021, could you offer a bit of perspective on kind of Canada Potex and say a little about how your company's been navigating through that?
You bet, Mark, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Maybe first, just a little bit about Campotex, and we're one of the largest suppliers of potash in the world and one of Canada's largest exporter. So infrastructure and supply chain, very important to our business. We market about 13 million metric tons per year to 40 countries around the world. So in potash, if you're not aware of it, is a fertilizer that's essential for global food security. So we like to say we help the world grow the food that it needs. And it's one of Canada's largest exporter to markets like Brazil, China, India, Indonesia. Infrastructure and supply chain is super important. And we've done it for a long time. This is our 50th year in 2022. So it's something that our business has grown immensely over the years and continues to grow. And when we have a year like 2021 with just incredible, not only just a global pandemic, but if you think, one of our main corridors to market, we're producing in Saskatchewan and shipping from Western Canada, primarily to several ports, but Vancouver represents about 70% of our volume. So when we have the major events in 2021, like the fires in August, the BC fires, to the flooding and the mudslides and the devastation that brought on November 14th of last year, essentially wiping out that corridor for a period of time, it was devastating. And in fact, we're still recovering today from that, and with the support of our railroad partners. But having diversified supply to other ports was one way. We diverted traffic during that devastation. And so having that built into your infrastructure, into your supply chain, it's important. But really for us, there was no alternative to offset the loss of the devastation through BC and the challenges there and the capacity there. So really, from our perspective, we need to learn from this. And how do you build back better? How do you build in resiliency into your supply chain to minimize these disruptions, in particular with climate events in the future? And what are the options? What are the other optionalities, other ports that we can consider, and infrastructure that's required? But the BC corridor is really so critical to our business. When you have the major disruptions of 2021 during a global pandemic, it was really, really hard to recover.
So, Deborah, maybe I can go to you next. I mean, you're working at in an absolutely critical part of our air infrastructure at GTAA. So I'd be curious to kind of get some of your thoughts on this one from 2021 lessons learned.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here. Hello as well to all the audience and to panel colleagues. So very briefly, also about the Greater Toronto Airports Authority, the operator of Toronto Pearson Airport. Pearson is a globally renowned airport hub. historically has been the sixth most internationally connected airport in the world, and a large hub airport. Prior to the pandemic, 50 million passengers a year traveled through Pearson. It's a much, much smaller number now. Last year was about 20% of that. But, sometimes it's not so clear about the role that air transport plays in the supply chain. Oftentimes people think about the backlogs at ports and rail, et cetera, which are obviously very important, but particularly for high value and small electronic or pharma type goods, air transport is very, very critical. It's also a very efficient way because the majority of transporting cargo, because aircraft typically carry 70% of air cargo in the belly of that aircraft and not in dedicated freighters. So there's a very important nexus to air cargo in the supply chain. I'll focus on one area, which is the digitalization. We know that this next era that we're living in is about the digitalization of everything. Years ago, I would reflect on Moore's Law, which said the power of computing would double every 2 years. And at the time, it seemed like an opportunity. It seemed like something to take advantage of going forward. Now it is a necessity. It's essential. When we had a small roundtable before the real heart of the supply chain problem came into being, but in 2020, with cargo providers all throughout the ecosystem, the number one aligned issue was the need to digitalize the system in Canada. It's incredible to think about how much is still manual, paper-based, and not integrated, and the lack of efficiency as a result of that. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity and imperative that needs to have a sense of urgency for us to digitalize en masse and get more efficiency out of the air cargo system as part of the resiliency that can be built up in Canada's supply chain.
Yeah, and I think that point about digitization is something that we've heard a lot from members. I'm thinking about, the phrase wet ink documents. I mean, something I'd never heard pre-pandemic, but we were hearing a lot about from companies who just they couldn't get into the office, couldn't get paper signed, and it meant goods weren't moving. So I think digitization, absolutely, critical, and it's something that actually affects all sizes of business too. It's not just a big company's issue.
Absolutely, freight forwarders, trucking companies, small and large. They will be more efficient. They'll have better labor. They'll actually be able to break even in a incredibly, or make a profit as we would like. But it's going to require that we are all smarter through the use of digital tools across the entire system.
So Robin, maybe we'll go to you next. I mean, Gord had kind of teed up some of the challenges that you were working through, but really at Port of Vancouver, I think it's fair to say you've been at the epicenter of so much of what's been in the news the last couple of months. So, I mean, hopefully we're not dredging up too many bad memories from last year, but yeah, love to hear some of your experiences from 2021.
Sure, thanks, Mark. No, and likewise, it's great to be here and be part of this panel. I mean, just to explain, so I'm the President and CEO of the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. We're the arm's length sort of federal organization that manages the development of the Port of Vancouver on behalf of Canada and Canadians. And really building on what Gord has already said, I mean, 2021 was, in some ways, it was a pretty biblical year for the supply chain through Canada. We had the effects of a pandemic, and then we had fires, and then we had floods. So I'm not quite sure what more we could have had. But there are some really key lessons, I think, that we can take away from it. And in many ways, while it was extremely difficult for many Canadian businesses, but also actually the supply chain was remarkably resilient when you think of what was thrown at it. And I think, so while we are still recovering from November, we actually had 3 weeks with virtually no rail service. And here we are sort of through January and February, and things are moving again. And we're actually starting to move back towards normal, only 2 months down the timeline. And two key strengths that underpinned that were the more than a decade of investment in corridor infrastructure. That meant that we had sort of, once the corridors were reestablished, or during the sort of the surges in the pandemic, we had the capacity to move goods efficiently to and from the port. And that's something that's, you can never stand still. We are a trading nation, trade is growing. We've got to keep that investment going to continue to build that fluidity in the corridors that gives some resiliency to the supply chain and gives capacity for the growth that we need to see as a nation. The other piece, going back actually to the conversation about data, we have more than I think any other gateway in North America, good supply chain performance data, and we're continuing to work on that. And it focuses people around a common set of information, understanding what is happening and working together to solve the problems, to keep the supply chain moving, to drive further efficiency. And that's, again, it's something that, just as Deborah was saying, the opportunity there is huge to take that further. So we need to continue to drive in that. But for me, the two most sobering lessons actually are thinking about the medium term. Infrastructure is a long-term game. And what worries me is there are two issues that we still need to address that could put us right back in the situation we've been in the last year, but for a made in Canada set of reasons. Industrial land is sort of the lifeblood of a port system, and industrial land near the port is essential to keep growing the port. And we're the tightest industrial land market in North America, here in the Lower Mainland. So we are going to be constrained on our ability to grow efficiently if we can't start to solve that problem more effectively. And the second one is container capacity. I mean, we know already in 5 years' time, we will have run out of container capacity. That's going to drive for the businesses across the country dependent on containers to import intermediate goods or to export to markets around the world. They're going to struggle in terms of efficient access to markets. We've been working for 10 years on this problem. We have a project that's 9 years into environmental assessment, the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project. In the interests of Canada, we have to move that project forward. So I would say we can see what we've done that's helped us through a very difficult year, but we can look forward and see the same problems coming again if we don't address some of these fundamental issues.
Great, thanks for that. And so, I mean, we've had a chance to hear from the infrastructure users and two different modes of operation. So, Aaron, I want to bring you into the conversation because at the end of the day, this has to be financed in order to be built. It doesn't sort of appear on its own, unfortunately. And so, in an era where we have constrained public finances, both at the federal, provincial, and local levels, we really do have to prioritize and I think identify how or what projects should be funded in order to, put those dollars where they should be spent most effectively. From the Canada Infrastructure Bank perspective, I'd be curious to kind of get your take on how we can go about that process of project identification, because I know as the CIB has been stood up over the last number of years, you've been heavily thinking about these very types of issues as you work with institutional investors and others to identify, where does the money need to go?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me, and nice to be here with fellow panelists. And as you say, we're all part of the same ecosystem and work together from financing and funding through the users and all the way to customers and markets. I think your question is such an important one, Mark, and you actually hinted at the answer in your intro to our panel when you talked about what infrastructure is, the movement of goods, the movement of people, the building of the economy and the society that we want. And I think the word infrastructure, actually, I don't want to get philosophical, but it's used by many people to mean many things. But at the root of it, at the CIB, we come back to the outcomes that infrastructure buy for you. And so to answer your question, the way we think about it at the CIB, and we're really, think of us like an impact investor acting on behalf of Canadians to get the most impactful, most important critical infrastructure built that currently is facing financing gaps. And we're trying to fill those gaps. So we have this lens of impact, and we look at every investment from the sense of what does this infrastructure deliver tangibly in terms of greening our economy and making the transition to a lower carbon footprint. So, tons of GHG emitted by building a transit system, or number of new transit riders, tons of goods that trade capacity that we can grow. So we look at trade corridors and how can we grow those, number of homes connected to broadband that aren't. So we have a core set of measures, and those are 4 of them. Another is around closing gaps in Indigenous communities who face a particular infrastructure challenge. So for any project, we score it against those things and say, how much does it buy us of that good? How many tons of traffic does it allow us to upgrade? How many new transit riders might this enable? And through that, you can start to figure out how to allocate scarce dollars. That's really how we look at the problem. And I think that's why the CIB was created, was to bring a bit more of that lens to our investments. We look at an ROI calculation where the return side of it is those public outcomes. And then we balance that against the investment of taxpayer dollars.
No, and I think that's really helpful for people to peel back a little bit of the curtain as to how CIB operates, again, being such a new institution. So Gord, maybe I'd be curious to get your take as an infrastructure user, and how does the process of prioritization need to unfold from your vantage point?
You bet, Mark. I think it's a good question. And of course, from our perspective, we're a big proponent of prioritizing trade enabling infrastructure. If you think about really the last 2 years of the pandemic and so many unknowns about the economy early on. In particular, at the beginning of the pandemic, bulk commodities were very reliable to Canada and our GDP, and potash exports continue to be a very bright spot in the economy. And our brand, as I mentioned, we've been around 50 years, but as a Canadian exporter and a Canadian company moving millions of tons through our existing infrastructure, reliability really matters. And our brand is that we talk to customers with and markets with are all about, we're being Canada's potash company. We're reliable. You can count on us. We'll deliver. We'll be on time. So prioritizing, in our view, the trade enabling infrastructure is where it's at. We also have invested as Campotex in that supply chain, over $1 billion over the years. But yeah, we need to be competitive. We need to be on the mark and keep pace with the rest of the world. We have very strong competition from other markets outside of Canada. And I think I was seeing that according to the World Bank, our logistics performance was in 2007, 10th place globally. And in 2018, it dropped to 20th place. So competition is growing and getting more fierce, and reliability matters. So the investment in prioritizing trade enabling infrastructure, in our opinion, is where it's at.
Yeah, and I think some of those World Bank surveys, as you were mentioning, I was thinking back actually to one of the other metrics that I know we think a lot about, which is border efficiencies, and where Canada's scores have also plummeted, unfortunately, a lot in that space. So I think that's a message that resonates with a lot of folks in the audience. Maybe Deborah, I can go to you next. I mean, you've had to navigate a lot of choices and trade-offs over the last 2 years from the airport's perspective. And what does that look like for you in the prioritization process about where to invest in infrastructure?
Yeah, we're probably, as a Canadian aviation sector, very good examples about having to make trade-offs and realizing we have to think so much more creatively, require our partners to as well, in order to not lose more of our competitive advantage, because we've lost particularly quite a bit. Throughout the course of the pandemic, we've had to take on what will be almost $1 billion in additional debt that has not gone towards an asset base that you can amortize over 40 years, but it's gone to something much bigger, much more as important, if you will. When the Antonov landed at the airport back in 2020, full of PPE at a time when it was not able to be found or generated here, like that was a regaling moment. I've never seen so many people line up. And as much as, there are aviators that love the plane, many people were there for that, but it was for something much deeper. Because those critical supplies were being brought into the country. And so our investment of that money served an incredible purpose. But we still are looking now, how do we ensure that we can digitalize the future, respond to the green economy? Our industry is committed to making that carbon neutrality transition. But I can certainly raise our hand when we think about how daunting it is, the $2 trillion per annum investment that is needed to transition to a green economy. Like, that's very real and for us here. So I would say a sense of urgency is what's needed, right? Infrastructure it takes so long to build that maybe there's a sense that we can take a long time to plan it and to execute it perfectly. And perfection will be the enemy of the good in this case. We need to have a rapid and an urgent plan to focus on the top priorities. I've seen all of our sectors that are represented here, plus more, be so part collaborative and in partnership to make trade-offs and difficult choices to better the collective. And we can do that again when it comes to infrastructure by unlocking that urgent plan and working together collaboratively to prioritize and to move the agenda forward.
So, Robin, I think that's a good segue over to you. I mean, I know you have some projects that have been in the pipeline for a little while, and so how do we go about, again, demonstrating success and having accountability and having those right KPIs as part of the decision-making process?
Yeah, for some of the projects, a little while would be a polite understatement, but yeah. But let me sort of take the question holistically. I mean, first off, Deborah's made some really good points, and I think one of the key measures that I look at when I'm looking at this, and we can reflect on it as success if we look at the Western gateways, is getting the level of private investment and giving the confidence to private investors to invest in creating capacity. So the National Trade Corridors Fund and the Asia Pacific Gateway and Corridor Initiative before it where we put a big focus on understanding, and we as the port led the process to understand where are the bottlenecks in the rail network in the Lower Mainland, what do we do to fix them, in what order, and then the government providing funding for third to a half of those projects to get them to critical mass, and then delivering those projects. As a result of that, in the last decade or so, we've expanded the capacity of the Port of Vancouver by around the capacity of the Port of Montreal. And that's the second largest port in Canada. And that's happened because companies like Campotex have had the confidence to invest in capacity in the port and have done so. And the list is long. It's Campotex, it's Teck, it's K+S, it's soon to be BHP, who are competitors of goods, but they're similarly important users, or the grain sector, huge investments like G3, like by Viterra, by Richardson. So the model works. But the things that we need to focus on, so very much Deborah's point, is a sense of urgency around some of it. I mean, the Terminal 2 project that I've mentioned in my opening remarks, that is so critical. I mean, this is capacity Canada needs to be able to continue to be a trading nation. And we're going to run out of that capacity in 5 years' time. It's been in the federal approval process for 9 years. And once we get the federal approval, we have probably got 2 more years of permitting to do. Now, to be clear, we totally support good environmental decision-making, and we're absolutely committed to protecting the environment. But we have to be able to get answers faster than that. Otherwise, we're going to have a made in Canada problem on our doorstep.
So maybe if I can go, back to you, Deborah, just to ask a question around non-financing, mechanisms. What are some of the things that you think can be done that don't involve cutting checks? To put it bluntly, to help infrastructure projects move along.
Not cutting checks. What kind of day is this? So no. Look, I think the pandemic has taught us that there have been radical shifts in the world, and we've had the philosophy that no deal is ever 100% done, right? Because we've seen whether it is force majeure, double black swans that we've experienced, with all of our partners, we've had to go back and to make adjustments to the way we thought the deals were going to play out. And I think that, really resounds today. And in particular, I think about, suggestions that we've had with the government of Canada on how to re-look at the model with airports. As I just referenced, $1 billion of non-asset-based debt taken on by the GTAA for all very important reason. But part of that expenditure of debt involves paying the government rent. During the pandemic for 2021 and the years going forward, we still will be paying the government rent, even though deferred. We've been allowed to defer. I think about the power of that, say, $100 million a year, extrapolate it to 10, that's $1 billion, and how much more valuable we can make that investment into infrastructure. So, rethinking some of the models because of this changed landscape, I think gives an opportunity, even if it's in a temporary way, right? That we are still in not just a recovery, but trying to create a huge impetus, a stimulating effect on a growth economy, that we may need to do some things differently in our traditional agreements for the next several years. I think that's it's a non-financial way. It's not cutting a check. It's just looking at the flow of money a bit differently to help create that economic impact and growth and stimulate the economy and its productivity, particularly in the transportation sector.
So, Gord, maybe we can go to you next for a perspective on, again, the non-monetary ways that we can help the infrastructure ecosystem get moving.
Sure, and well said. I think from our perspective, we would recommend you formalize long-term rolling infrastructure plans. As I've said, our brand is around reliability, and we also need to have skin in the game with our own investments and making our own investments and plan based on capacity and reliability of that infrastructure is highly important to us, and it helps us be predictable because many capital projects, as we all know, can take many years, and so if you can formalize your infrastructure plans longer term, to have alignment in ensuring various contributors are not working at cross purposes. So again, I just want to reinforce how important it is for us to be able to deliver in a highly competitive market, be reliable, do it on time, then and be prepared for when you have circumstances like what happened in BC here this past year with all the devastation, that we're able to respond and deliver in other ways.
Yeah, Mark, if I may, I think your question's a really important one, but it's interesting, this split between, you're asking about non-financial mechanisms. We're the CIB, we provide financing, but interestingly, what we're finding in the projects we're engaged in, Mark, is the real issue is around risk and uncertainty and how we can better share that. It's not about the money necessarily. I give you an example. We did a project recently with Enwave, the district energy company in Toronto. I use it just as an example. It would be true in many of our sectors, where they're a private company building infrastructure, investing money, and thinking about the long term. And they're going to build a new expansion to their district energy system. If you're doing that privately alone, you got to worry about what's the uptake, how long is it going to take for customers to sign up? You're betting on the future development in and around the downtown core of Toronto and how many customers sign up when. And if through our financing and others like us, other impact investors, others in the ESG space are willing to invest in that system, be patient capital, wait over a longer time frame, maybe have payment contingent on the ramp up of when customers sign up to their system, what you're doing, it's not about the money, it's about the risk you're helping that company manage. And as a result, in that case, Enwave, backed by their institutional capital that supports them, can build the system much bigger than they would have otherwise. And I think that's the way we have to think, is about what can we use dollars to enable, and that's true. Trade assets are particular. I mean, these are 100-year assets that we're building in many cases, and they have an uncertain ramp up, uncertain revenue. They're in a globally competitive environment. Robin's adding to his port. He's got to think about Long Beach up to the north of BC and everywhere in between, the East Coast. I mean, he's in an interesting space, and he's doing that across 75 or 100 years. So the question is, how can we use innovative tools? And this is part of what the CIB is one in the toolkit. We don't presume to be all of it, but how can we create tools to help de-risk or share those? Because a lot of time what slows those projects down, Robin talked about environmental assessments, those are really important, but a big part of it is risk and uncertainty that frees us. And when you're making investments that are, the nature of infrastructure being so long-term, you've got to find a way to get through some of that and to share that collaboratively across the private sector and public sector sponsors.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It looks like, Robin, you want to come in and jump in.
I'd actually like to come in on both Aaron and Gord's points, because they both made really good points. And to pick Aaron's first, just sort of going in that order, there is a real opportunity, and I think the CIB presents a sort of a great avenue for dealing with that risk issue, exactly as Aaron describes. Because, the projects that we look at, they have significant economic returns. But they have material risks, in many cases more to do with timeline than actual end outcome. And they're big. And the challenge is that the project is going to have the outcome, and it's going to cost a lot of money. But if those two things get out of line, you can have an existential problem. And so having a creative way of dealing with that risk issue, in the knowledge that it is almost certain the outcome is going to be positive, but the timing of the outcome may not be predictable completely, and you've got to have a way of bridging that uncertainty. That's a role where I think the CIB can play a unique role that's going to be really critical. I'd also like to go back to Gord's point about just sort of having that infrastructure strategy, because that is so important. And there's started to be an emerging conversation about a national infrastructure assessment leading to a national infrastructure strategy. And I just can't reinforce how important that is, because infrastructure is long-term and it's expensive. And we are in a democracy, which is absolutely where we want to be, where political issues tend not to be quite so long-term and don't necessarily drive towards focusing on the issues in a sort of a 10, 20-year way. And we really need, I think, something where we can objectively start to build nationally an understanding of where we need to be investing in infrastructure and create momentum around that solution that can survive the inevitable challenges of a political cycle, is going to be a really important asset in trying to actually get the infrastructure we need as a nation.
So, Aaron, I'm going to go back to you, and this is picking up on, Robin said, talking about things are expensive, takes a long time, but in Canada's case, we also have long distances. And so this is where the digital connectivity piece, comes in quite critically, especially for rural and remote communities. And so, I'd just be curious to kind of get a take on some of what CIB's been doing to help facilitate some of that digital connectivity across the country.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it, Mark? We've seen, and I'm sure your members and those on the call today can speak to this, the pandemic has revealed just how fundamental digital connectivity is for us as a method of commerce, healthcare, education, and social connectivity and entertainment. So it's somewhere we've all realized, I think, in the last few years, just how critical it is. And as you say, the nature of our country is such that population density makes it really hard. The government of Canada set a goal to have all Canadians connected at minimum speeds. And we've devoted $3 billion of our portfolio to investment in broadband connection. We've done a number of those investments already in the last year in Manitoba, in Ontario, soon in Alberta to come, getting to smaller and more remote communities. So I think this is wave one, but in many ways, Mark, this is table stakes. And our goal is to deploy our money to get the million or so households in Canada that don't have 50/10 broadband speed onto functional broadband immediately. And that's what we're working on. And that's been a great collaboration with provinces who are, because here's the thing, Mark, that, as Robin said, there are many infrastructure projects that have payback. It's just long and uncertain and bumpy, but the ultimate is clear. Broadband's a little different. Broadband's math. We have a density of population. And if you're an ISP in southern Manitoba or northern Alberta or northern Ontario, and you look at the number of customers and the cost of build out and the lifetime value of those customers, sometimes the math just doesn't work. And so in that case, a blend of potentially some grants, which might come from a provincial government or they might come from the federal government, and some innovative financing from us, which might be long term, might be low cost, might be risk sharing, but you often need to put those two things together, which is why, as I said earlier, we're only one tool in the toolkit, especially in something like broadband. But if you can do those things now as an ISP, you can improve the economics to a point where it's profitable and possible to go serve those customers. And so that's what we're doing. We work really closely with our colleagues at the federal level and in the provinces. And what that's doing, as I said, is that's quickly getting the build out happening. And our goal is to reach 750,000 homes over the next 3 years through our investments, and we're on track for that. I think from there, though, the real question is just about what the next wave of digital infrastructure looks like in our country. And those of us on this panel, especially colleagues like Gord and Robin and Deborah, would have a certain lens on that around the digital connectivity required to make trade flow. But there are others equally important, I would say, like how are we going to increase the capacity of our transit and transportation systems? How do we make autonomous vehicles work so that our highways flow without us having to build new highways as we invest? How do we make buildings more efficient so that they are smarter than ever before and can therefore use as little energy and be as both cost effective and also climate effective as possible? So I think to the next wave of digital infrastructure, wave one, we've got to get universal access. Wave two is how do we invest in trade enabling, transit enabling, and energy efficiency enabling digital infrastructure in new ways. And that's where the CIB is starting to turn our attention. Right now, our main focus, as I said, is on that home connectivity, but that's the next wave, Mark.
So we're getting some audience Q&A coming in. And so what I want to do is we'll do a quick sort of tie up on the panel discussion, then we'll start going over to Slido. So maybe, Deborah, I'd be really curious to talk a little bit about ESG investing. And this is something that we have been alluded to a little bit earlier in the panel, but to pick up on what Nick Nanos was saying this morning, it's a freight train, not in a bad way, but it's a freight train that's coming. And so I'd be curious again to get a bit of a perspective from GTAA on how you're seeing the ESG piece and infrastructure investments and projects.
Yeah, like it's here already. Whether it is from the environmental perspective, GTA long ago committed to a sustainability platform. 2006, since 2006, we've reduced our carbon emissions by 60%. That's great, but the 40% left to get to net zero comes at a steep price. But I'm pleased to see across every sector the recognition of the ESG lens and focus. Larry Fink in his annual letter, he said that every single corporation is going to be affected by this transition to net zero. You either lead or you will be led one way or another, right? And so we've all got to grapple with that. When I think about what somewhat Aaron just said, and our focus on the tools and the pathway to be able to get to an ESG better world and framework, I think about our investment like in rails, for instance, and in transit. There is an incredible opportunity to take that investment in transit, knowing that it is a pathway to greening the economy. So I think it's very fulsome that the industry is committed and focused on transitioning into both not just the environmental but the social element. Airports, for instance, are natural economic clusters. Over the course of time, ports, whether they were seaports or airports, created large cities in and around them because of the stimulating effect. Why? Because of the jobs. There is a reason why Pearson Airport has the second largest employment zone around it in Canada, the second largest. There's a stimulating effect that comes from our multimodal transportation facilities. Then that leads to the type of jobs that are created, not just a creation of a plethora of jobs, but are those good jobs? Are they sustainable jobs? Do they reflect the communities in and around them? Are the workers reflective of this country's model of inclusivity and a forward and proactive stance on immigration? So there are many, many elements of ESG and how they play out. But I think the transportation sector and those that are here on this call today have an outsized opportunity, an outsized role in leading the country as corporate citizens toward a place where ESG principles and practices are demonstrated to get to a much better outcome for the future.
No, thanks for that. And let's maybe now shift over to the Slido questions that are coming in. And Gord, actually, I'll put this question to you first. There's someone who's written here about international examples of best practice, and Canada Potex being in the export market. You don't just put things on a ship and then forget about it. There's going to be an end user who needs to offload it and get it to their customers in markets. So, what some of your experience has been as to who is getting this right, or maybe at least who is doing it better, that we can learn from when it comes to that infrastructure?
Well, yeah, thanks, Mark. I think it's a great question. And maybe the good news, although our competitiveness may be dropping, as I mentioned, but Canada's, at least with our business, and as I say, our reliability and our brand is very strong and very high. And how we do business and the integrity of doing business is viewed as world class around the world. As I said, we've been doing it for 50 years and have long standing relationships and growth. But we do partner with our customers around the world. Everywhere outside of Canada and the US is where Campotex sells. And I'd say, we partner, and part of it is communication. And you're exactly right. The supply chain for us, the first part of the supply chain is moving from Western Canada to the port, and then on a vessel to country, whether it's Brazil, whether it's China, India, or Southeast Asia. So we're working with a lot of different countries, and Canada's a reliable piece of that whole chain. I'd say there's massive opportunity in countries like Brazil, where they don't have the same infrastructure, and we have vessels sitting for weeks at a time to unload because of the infrastructure or lack of infrastructure in Brazil. So they're working as they continue to grow as a market. I'd say our big markets, our big five: China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brazil. Those are the big five that are food. It's a food story and growing food and needing our products, and so working closely with them in communication and making sure that the supply chain is streamlined and able to deliver all the way to the field in those countries mentioned. Those are the big important ones for us, and they're continuing to improve as well. I wouldn't say any that we'd necessarily model the Canadian after. I think we just need to build on what we have and continue to invest and create that competitive advantage for Canada, because I think it's a great story of where we are, but we can't get complacent. We need to continue to invest, continue to get better in a lot of the areas we've been talking to today.
No, I think that's a great perspective to have, and certainly the nature of our federal provincial system creates unique quirks that not every other jurisdiction has to deal with, and certainly is a challenge on an ongoing basis. There was a question that came in an interesting one about cybersecurity and how critical infrastructure is adapting and remaining resilient in the face of an increasingly disruptive environment. Maybe Robin, I can go to you first. I mean, I'd just be curious to get a Port of Vancouver perspective on how you're seeing the cyber landscape, and what is that we need to be doing looking ahead to ensure that infrastructure keeps resilient.
Yeah, I think the question was framed along the lines of sort of, is it a risk? And the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, we spend a lot of time on it, as do most of the organizations who are involved in the port system. The general view would be you have to plan on the basis of when, not if, which is a pretty sobering realization. And it is something that we have to be continuing to invest in, and to invest in the specialist skills. It's a fast changing, emerging space. But we can look around the world, and there are, I mean, at one end of the spectrum, you're dealing with state-sponsored actors. As individual organizations, we are never going to have the capacity to manage those sort of threats on our own. So there is actually a national role to play, and there is good work going on, actually, in Canada, about making sure that organizations are connected to that expertise in an appropriate way. But it's something that really, I think, is sort of, in simple terms, there's little more that you can say than don't believe it won't happen, and be investing in having the right expertise and continual testing and upgrading of the systems. Because not unlike infrastructure and corridors, it's not something you can do and forget. It's something you have to keep doing.
Yeah, I would add, it really is. It is an infrastructure investment, right? As we talked about these digital investments and digital infrastructure and how important they are. Absolutely support what you've said, Robin. At the GTA, we've been running cybersecurity tabletops that were almost equivalent to full-scale exercises for those that are in the emergency environment. And so there's a lot to be learned. You want to be ready and to be prepared. So, how can you switch to an analog type environment for some time if necessary? But even, I think as importantly is that the national security preparedness element. We are all part of critical national security or national important organization and institutions. And so the national security posture, knowing those partners, before the event, very similar to how we would deal with a natural physical crisis. As a country and as respective organizations, we should be just as equipped knowing how to respond to those massive cyber events as we are for physical events.
Aaron, it looks like you wanted to come in on this one as well.
Well, I was just going to say, Mark, it's interesting. You used the word resiliency at the end of your question. And I think it is, the question on cybersecurity is just one flavor of a broader issue, which is when you're talking about infrastructure assets that are long lasting, there's a few things mistakes that commonly get made. One is a lot more effort and a lot more money goes into the building of it than the operations and making sure that you're investing in renewal of infrastructure. It's seductive to worry about building the new stuff without putting the money into ongoing maintenance. And second of all, there's a real risk that we don't invest when we're building it with scarce money and the gap we have, and you're trying to make your money go as far as you can. It's always a challenge to invest in the kind of resiliency that you need to. And we started this whole conversation about 2021 and its biblical elements. But the thing is, at this point, we've had 100-year floods. I'm in Toronto, like Deborah. We've had 100-year floods, I think 3 times in the last 7 years. Those aren't 100-year floods anymore. Those are climate. We have to, and like that's where Robin's point about cyber saying it's not if, it's when. We have to take that attitude about other forms of resiliency as well, and that has cost to it. And this is a tough trade-off. It means investing in hardening or building those systems more robustly, ready for flood protection or fire, ready for cyber attack and hardened digitally. But all of those things are real trade-offs, because every dollar you put into that means one less dollar you're putting into new infra, and our needs exceed our financial capacity. So all that to say, I think in the planning of infrastructure, you've got to plan for resiliency, whether that's digital or physical, and we've got to be willing to invest in it because we're building long-term assets here.
Well, and I think, Aaron, that's a good segue into another question that came in through Slido here on climate adaptation. Someone very kindly directed it to me, but I'll sort of deflect it instead back to the panel. So maybe, Aaron, I could start with you to pick up on that theme about climate resiliency, and whether it's flooding or fires. How is that climate resiliency perspective feeding into the decision making that CIB is doing, and when they look at projects?
Well, as I said, when we look at the outcomes of infrastructure and we're looking at the dollars, we're putting Canadian taxpayer dollars to work to get new infrastructure built, we're looking at those outcomes over the long term. So for us, part of the calculation is and has to be around how resilient they're going to be in the future. And Deborah talked earlier about ESG. You know, for us, it's not just a branding, it's not just a part of what we do. We are an impact investor. Every single one of our investments are made to improve outcomes for Canadians, whether, as I said earlier, that's broadband connectivity or transit ridership or GHG emission reduction. So all of our investments we look at through the lens of sustainability, and we're trying to make them in that way. Now, what we're seeing is the economics of projects getting more and more challenging as you have to make realistic choices about resiliency. And I think there, Mark, the way we think about it is, if what you're trying to buy is an outcome, like number of new riders in a transit system, and if that transit system isn't reliable and won't be able to withstand the climate shocks that we're going through, whether that's flood protected, et cetera, then you're not going to get your outcomes. So that is a necessary cost and has to be baked into the asset. And that's how we're looking at them. And it's interesting, you know, the last year or so, the CIB has been pretty busy. We've made 20 or so investment commitments. It's totaling for our life to date, somewhere close to $7 billion. And that's matched by more than that in private sector capital that goes along with us. What we're seeing, Mark, in those investments are over and over again, project owners, whether it's railroads, ports like Robbins, airports, and others, are coming to us with their pitches of how does this investment buy long-term outcomes, including resiliency, and we're willing to put money into that. So it's really, we're seeing it real time.
So maybe, Gord, I can go to you with this question, because again, you're a company that needs to move your goods on the infrastructure. And so when you're thinking about the risks to moving your products, how does climate resiliency fit into some of those perspectives?
Yeah, well, I think Aaron brought up some great points and totally aligned that we need to build in that resiliency. And I forget who said it, but the 300-year floods in the last 10 years, you know, this is the new normal. And how do we minimize these disruptions from climate events in the future is key in the way we're looking at it. And as I mentioned, you know, we have a good brand and reliability, but there's areas that needs to catch up, and it's starting to age. And we've got examples just on our BC corridor. For example, the new Westminster Bridge to Vancouver's North Shore is expected to surpass capacity by 2030, and the federal government has launched a study on this bridge. But if we were to lose that unexpectedly, for whatever reason, that would have devastation when 70% of our volume goes over that bridge. So I think it's just building in that resiliency, planning, preparing, expecting. It's the same with cybersecurity. You know, it's the new normal, and we need to expect it to happen. It's not a matter of if, more of when. And the same applies to some of our aging infrastructure that you just need to bring in more resiliency, optionality, investment, and you know, don't take any of this for granted.
So I think we'll be able to fit in the two more interventions here before we have to wrap up. So maybe, Robin, I'll go to you. I'd be curious to get some of your perspectives again on this climate adaptation piece, because again, not to bring up 2021 too much, but again, you've been thinking a lot about these things, I can imagine, over the last number of months.
For sure, and I mean, and the comments already are really to the point. I would say that, I mean, that there has been a lot of good work going on in the Lower Mainland about understanding flood risk over the last five or more years. The challenge is exactly the challenge that Aaron highlighted, that the dealing with it's expensive, and from a political perspective, dealing with spending $1 on today's problem or $1 on a problem that looks like it may be several years away, today's problem is normally noisier. So I think to mess the metaphors around, I mean, hopefully there is a silver lining in the clouds of the atmospheric river that caused the flooding, where we can actually get some attention on what needs to be done. Because the sobering thing about flood resilience is you're only as good as everybody. I mean, if the water finds a way in, it doesn't matter how good your flood defenses were along your stretch of the river or your stretch of the ocean, the water comes around the back. So I really do hope that there is the opportunity coming out of this kind of biblical year we've been through, where the supply chain is topical in a way it never has been before. And we've had an all too real and painful demonstration of the risks of climate events overwhelming our infrastructure, I really hope that provides the foundation for building some of these longer term solutions and directing some funding towards what are expensive issues. But I mean, just to take one last example, I mean, most of the flooding in BC actually came across in the Lower Mainland, actually came across from the Nooksack River in the US. And there are various, I don't know how valid they are, but there are various sort of quotes floating around that it was a matter of tens of millions to address that at source. And it's going to have cost several billion in terms of the consequences. Those are the equations. And the trouble is they don't happen every year, but they are happening more and more often. And we've got to be starting to really address those consequences those issues in that strategic way, spending the right money on the right issues before we have the problems that are even far, far, far more expensive.
Yeah, an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure, as they say. So Deborah, I'll give the last question to you before we wrap up, and that's just around the digital adoption piece. And you talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but I wonder if you could maybe just end off by offering a kind of a perspective or two on what is it that we can do to help accelerate the digital adoption piece from the infrastructure ecosystem standpoint.
Yeah, and I think, Mark, that question almost can go for everything that we were just talking about. I think there are just some really salient points, whether it's the digital adoption and the direct benefits it can make. We have, a heavy built environment in all of the sectors that are represented here today. And through digital, we can make those built environments more elastic, which helps our assets be expanded further with, lesser cost. Both to the environment and also from financial perspective. But, I think our job here in this discussion as leaders, as I just contemplate on everything I've heard from my great panelists, we have a very difficult job in front of us. But it is a false choice for us to think that we can not invest today's dollars, even in this terrible financial climate, to ensure that we have resiliency for the future. It's a failure in our planning as leaders if we have not invested these scarce resources to make sure that we're more resilient digitally, more resilient from weather, more resilient from all of the impacts of climate change and where we see that the society is going. So we've got to think about our assets, how we get there perhaps a bit differently. Aaron talked about it with the resiliency and the models and the risk sharing. It is not just design and build, right? The way we used to with our assets. We've got to look at full life cycle costs, design, the build, the operate, and the maintain, and how all of these elements intersect and make, and I think we're very equipped. There's such talent and expertise in Canada for us to be the leaders in how to do smart infrastructure investing during and coming out of this pandemic and into a really great growth productivity era for the country.
Well, we could have kept going, and it's always a good sign when there's more audience Q&A than there is time to answer it. So let me just say, Deborah, Aaron, Robin, and Gord, thanks so much for giving us your time this afternoon to share these perspectives. We could have kept going with, but unfortunately, we do have to go to the next panel. So I hope everyone in the audience found some good takeaways from that as we continue to talk about this theme of economic growth and look at some of the infrastructure aspects that are part of it.